Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So I'm not sure if you can tell, but we're filming from a slightly different vantage point, a little bit higher up in the air. I was having some problems with my last stand, but I think this looks just fine. I think it's a decent angle. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. So then moving on to the topic of this video. Today I'm going to be giving you my thoughts on the overpopulation and just the overall tendency of people to lean towards power or spin rackets over control rackets. I think there's a very particular set of things, of qualities that the control rackets offer that's just very hard to replicate with the power rackets. So I'll get into that in this video. First, there's probably a lot of you guys that don't really understand what I mean about power and spin rackets versus control rackets. So I've spent a lot of time studying rackets. It's just something that's really interesting to me. To me, or to you guys, it may seem not that important, but to me, it makes a very big difference how the racket plays into tennis itself, aside from just the player. When you think about it, really, tennis is a game of physics. It's a game of spin, depth, collision, miles per hour, change of velocity, change of force, inertia. There's so many things at play when it comes to striking a tennis ball and putting it in different parts of the opposing courts. And the racket you're using certainly makes a big difference. Like if you're in a sword fight or you're in a car race and you're bumping into other cars, a baseball bat you're playing with, the technology makes a very big difference on how the ball performs, how it handles the impact and the change of direction. So I think for that reason, it's very important to be thoughtful about your racket selection and how it will impact your game and stuff. But with that being said, so power rackets, they're your more stiff racket, larger head, more open string pattern. It gives a little bit more pop on the ball, and the strings are further apart. So there's actually a little bit more spacing between the strings. So the ball is able to sit into the strings more, and the strings can really dig into the ball in order to be able to spin it. And that sounds really good and stuff, but the only downside to that is, well, one, the racket is very stiff, so the ball takes a very powerful pop out of the racket, but also the strings are so far apart, it changes the angle in which the ball leaves the racket. I'm not exactly sure why this is, but when it's a very open string pattern, or the strings on the racket are far apart, when the incoming ball strikes the racket, instead of going out, like if my racket is pretty much completely flat, instead of the ball just going out at a normal height like this, the ball will actually leave the racket at a higher angle. So it's going up higher in the air out of your racket, and it's traveling deeper into the opposing court. What this means is that you have a little bit less control on the ball. You have less ability to predict where the ball goes after it leaves your racket. But that's what the topspin is for. When you get good topspin on the ball, you can bring the ball back down into the court or curve it just right into the spot you want or open up angles. But if you're using a power/spin racket with a really open string pattern and a very powerful racket, if you don't get good topspin on the ball could go in any which direction. It's very easy to hit the ball long or wide if you're really using an open string pattern, powerful racket. Like if you hit it a little bit flat, the ball will very likely go long or go wide because you don't have enough topspin to bring the ball down. This can also affect your volleys and field shots. If you're going for a drop shot or want to angle a volley right into an opposite court or right into the short corner, a loss of control can affect that because it just gives you a little bit less predictability, a little bit less feel of where the ball goes. A control racket, on the other hand, it's a much more flexible beamed racket. If I had a racket with me, I don't right now, but if I had a racket with me and the beam was thin, the racket will bend more so it absorbs some of the power and doesn't send the ball out of the racket with quite as much pop. Also, control rackets have a more dense string pattern where the strings on the racket are actually spaced closer together. If you've ever looked at a racket And you've seen in the specifications or the specs on the racket, if you see the area that says string pattern, it'll usually say 16 by 19 or 18 by 20. A lot of power and spin oriented rackets, they have the 16 by 19 pattern. What that means is that if I had a racket, there would be 6 strings going across the bottom, forming the vertical strings called the mains of the strings. Then for 16 by 19, the 19 would be the crosses, the amount of strings going sideways on the racket. So if you can just visualize it, if you have 16 main strings and 19 cross strings, that's less overall density on the string bed compared to an 18-20 racket, which has 18 strings in the middle and 20 strings in the crosses. So that means that the little squares you see between the strings are going to be smaller. They're going to be more dense on an 18 by 20 racket. A lot of control rackets with a thin beam, they have that 18-20 string pattern, or if not an 18-20, at least a more dense, more closely spaced 16 by 19 string pattern. So that this means when I'll do this hand with the racket, when the ball hits the racket, because the strings are closer together, I'm not exactly sure why this is, but the ball leaves the racket on a more controllable trajectory. This means that if you don't get enough spin, that you're less likely to hit the ball long or wide, because the ball is not going to travel as high and as far out of your racket. This means you're less likely to overhit the ball, either long or wide, if you don't get the sufficient spin to curve it back down into the court. It also, in my opinion, makes drop shots and feel shots and volleys off to the corner a little bit easier to control, because the ball doesn't take such a hard jump off the string bed. It comes out at a little bit more controllable of a height, and it also has less depth out of the string bed, because the strings are closer together and there's more strings overall, so they don't bend as much. If you have less strings, the string bed can feel very loose and the ball sinks into the strings and springs out. If you have a 18 by 20 racket, it maintains tension better, because the ball doesn't sink quite as far into the strings, so it's less likely to spring too far out of your racket. So you have more control of how far and where the ball goes. So those are some of the advantages I think control rackets have. I think they also can serve an advantage on defense. I think power and spin rackets, if you have time to set up and really crank on the ball, it's easy to get good top spin and hit very powerful penetrating shots into the corners for winners and stuff. But if you have a more control racket, like you can use it to attack, because you can hit the shot coming out of your racket has more control and a more level trajectory, but it also makes a very big difference on defense, because you're able to absorb the ball and hit through it. Like if you're playing with a very powerful racket and someone hits the ball really fast right at your feet, it's very difficult to get the top-spin on a shot like that to control the shot. You're pretty much just going to have to block the ball back flat. And if you're using a power/spin racket, it's very easy for the ball to go long because you're not hitting it with spin anymore. You're just trying to block it back level, so the ball could very easily fly long. If you're using a control racket, though, you can hit through the ball or just block the ball back without getting a lot of spin, and the ball is less likely to sail out of your control. This means you can be more confident hitting through the ball and hitting flat through the shot right at your feet, a shot where you're under pressure. You don't have to worry about coming around the outside of the ball to control it like you would with a power or spin racket. You're able to make your timing and make your mechanics a little bit easier just by going through the ball on a defensive shot and having to worry less about the ball going long or wide compared to if you had a power/spin racket. So those are some of my thoughts, and I think it really does make a difference even at the highest level of tennis. I think when you look at not just the pros, but the highest ranked pros, and not just college players, but the very best college players, a lot of them use slightly control-oriented rackets, meaning the head size is a little bit smaller, the strings are a little bit denser, the racket's a little bit more flexible, thinner and softer. When you look at so many great players like Novak Djokovic, Agassi, Tsitsipas, Dominic Thiem, Arena Sabalenka, Murat Safin, Taylor Fritz, just to name a few. There's so many really, really high-ranked players using very control-oriented rackets. More control-oriented rackets than many players on the market. What's interesting about some of these players, last bit of racket nerd talk or whatever, but you see players like Djokovic, Taylor Fritz, Diego Schwartzman, whoever, they're endorsing these rackets like the Head Speed Pro and the Head Radical Pro, but they're very different from the rackets sold on the market today. The rackets they're using are actually all more control-oriented, meaning more flexible beam, tighter string pattern for Diego Schwartzman and Taylor Fritz. They're both using 1820 Head Radical rackets, even though the only Head Radical sold now is the 16x19. Even Novak Djokovic, he endorses the Head Speed Pro, which for those of you guys know, it's a 100 square inch racket to give you a little bit more forgiveness on the sweet spot, and also a rather thick beam, 23 millimeters, so it's about medium thickness, I'd say, for a tennis racket. The racket Djokovic plays with, however, is only a 95 square inch head, so the head size is much smaller, again, to rein in the power and give him more control. But his racket is way more flexible and softer and more control-oriented than the racket he endorses on the market today. It's a very thin beam, flexible racket, so the ball has very natural, very little natural power coming out of the racket. That's why his ball leaves his racket at a very controlled trajectory, because his racket is not too stiff, therefore it's not too powerful. So he has the ability to flatten out through the ball and hit through the ball and be very consistent with very low risk of the ball flying long or wide on him. He also uses a very dense string pattern on his racket. He used to use the 18x20 string pattern. Now he uses the 18x19, but I think it still has a very big impact on his game. You can have your own opinion about who the GOAT is and stuff, but he uses the most dense string pattern out of all the big four, including Nadal, Federer, and Murray. He's the only one that uses a 18x20, or originally an 18x20 string pattern, and now an 18x19 string pattern. And I think that's what that lets Djokovic do. It lets him do many of the things that his game is known for. Taking the ball on the rise, being very consistent, and being able to move the ball so well around the court. He uses the most control-oriented racket out of all of them, and it serves him a huge advantage. One, he's able to take the ball on the rise because he's not afraid of sailing the ball long if he mistimes it. He's very accurate on the court because his head size is small and the string pattern is very dense, so he has a very clear idea about where the ball is going to leave his racket after he hits it. And his racket is very heavy, so he's able to compensate for the lack of power or launch out of his racket compared to like a pure drive or pure arrow. He's able to make up for it by having such a heavy racket, and a heavy racket also helps him return really powerful, fast serves because the racket is very stable at impact. If you have a heavy racket, it's very less likely to be moved by the opposing shot, especially against a fastball. The racket's less likely to twist in your hand when absorbing a fast shot. And because he has the control-oriented launch out of his string bed with the dense string pattern, the thin beam, and he has a lot of weight in the head in order to counteract the ball, he's still able to get a very powerful, deep, controlled ball without risk of the ball unexpectedly sailing long or sailing wide. So with that being said, those are just some of the advantages I think that control-oriented rackets offer a player. Are they for everyone? Not necessarily. If your game is very based on topspin and you're really good at hitting that and you love your racket and you're playing well with it, by all means stick with it. But I'd say if you're a 16 to 25-year-old person, you're very strong, very fit, why are you necessarily looking for more power? Why are you looking for more spin? Medvedev's another player with a very control-oriented racket that I forgot to mention. He hits the ball very flat yet he has a ton of control. So I'm just saying, like, spin isn't the number one necessary thing for you in order to have control. You can play pretty much any style. That kind of brought me off point or whatever. But yeah, if you're strong, you're fit, you can run balls down, you don't necessarily need a more powerful or spin-friendly racket. I guess my point with Medvedev is that he's able to be very confident on the court, even without getting a lot of spin on the ball. People say you need spin in order to be very consistent, but Medvedev doesn't get a lot of spin, yet he's one of the most consistent players in the world. So that's why I just caution you not to be like over obsessed with spin. And also, it's still very easy to get spin with a control-oriented racket. It's just the amount of like racket head speed you get on the ball and how far you hit it on the side of the ball, meaning you're not hitting through the center of it to hit it flat, you're brushing around the outside of the ball. So the more you can just graze the felt of it and at a faster racket head speed, that's going to have a much bigger impact on the amount of spin you can get rather than just the racket you're using itself. So don't over glorifize power and spin in your racket, especially if you're a young fit player. That could be helpful to a little bit out of shape player that needs a little bit more power or depth out of their racket. But if you have trust in your own physical abilities and your racket head speed in order to generate your own spin without the racket doing it for you, I'd strongly consider getting a more control-oriented racket, because I think some of the most important things that are determining in matches is control, consistency, and pretty much just that. Who can control the field shots and have the biggest control over where the ball lands in the court. I find control, accuracy, and placement to be much more indicative for the success of opponent than which player has more power or spin. So those are just my thoughts. I challenge you to really think about the role the racket has in your game. Think about which players you like and you idolize on the court. Which rackets do they use? Like take that with a grain of salt, because sometimes they're not using the racket they're endorsing, and there's obviously no guarantees. But if you think that a certain racket would bring out the best qualities, would really accentuate your best qualities and abilities on the tennis court, or give you the little bit of extra control or consistency or placement you need, really think about what that can offer in your game. Or if you really think you need more power or more depth or more easy spin and you're not able to get enough racket head speed, or maybe you do have really good racket head speed, but power and spin is just such an important proponent of your game, think about how a racket like that would benefit you. So a little bit of a long video. I kind of rambled, but I appreciate everyone who watched. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you next time.